Well, it's a very strong criticism that has come chapter and verse, quoting graphs and charts, pointing out that not just inflation is way below the central bank and the MPC's target rate of 4%. It's been at 3 point something for several months now. Points out that core inflation, that is removing the volatile items like food and fuel, the true core, as he calls it, is also moving towards the 4% mark. And then he points out that a strong rupee usually will mean imports get cheaper, and that also is something that the Reserve Bank ought to take into account. He points to the very poor credit growth and therefore the rather weak economic growth conditions, and goes on to say that in spite of all this, we have tight monetary conditions and tight fiscal conditions. But his criticism doesn't end there. He goes on to the rating agencies and says that we have been the good boy with low credit to GDP, low debt to GDP, and falling debt to GDP, with China having a rising debt to GDP, and yet they get an upgrade and India doesn't get an upgrade. But his worst punchlines are for the critics. He says before the monetary policy, almost everyone wants a rate cut, and says the polls indicate that there will be a rate cut. Once the policy comes, everyone is rationalizing the Reserve Bank's position. He says there is no criticism in the policy space. That's the main point that he makes. But what is amazing is he says this is not even my point of view or the right point of view, but why is this point of view not in the public space? So he's basically criticizing the lack of debate and dissent in the public space on economic policy. Well, we have a guest with us. Abik Barua, the chief economist at HDFC Bank, joins us. Abik Barua, two separate questions for you. First of all, do you agree that policy is too tight, as the chief economic advisor seems to imply?
I have always been somewhat critical of the RBI stand.
Fair point.
And in my limited capacity as a columnist, and in my appearances on television shows like yours, I have pointed this out, and so have many other people. So I think Arvind is also being a little unfair in saying that there is no criticism of the RBI in the public space. The RBI has a well-argued point, and in terms of sheer numbers, I think, sheer optics, you will see an upward rising inflation path for the next 8 or 9 months or so, partly because of the base effect, partly because the commodity prices are higher than what they were last year. Having said that, I think there is Dr. Subramaniam does have a point to make, and I think I would sort of add to this by saying that there are certain components of core inflation or core inflation that are largely supply determined, and I think it's a sort of a losing battle that the RBI will fight if it tries to sort of address this with with interest rates or monetary policy. So I think this is this is not something new. I think this debate has been going on for a long time. I commend Dr. Subramaniam for taking a contrarian stance on a number of issues, including on the FRBM and now this. Coming from him, it has far more heft in sort of the public discourse than from other individuals.
Okay. Let me get Shaumyo in as well into this, Abik, but do stay on. Shaumyo Kanti Ghosh, do you think that the RBI's policy and the fiscal policy has been too tight in the first place? Criticism merited?
No, I tend to agree with Rovik's point, because if you remember in the February policy after it was released, we had also said that the shift to neutral stance was quite puzzling, and we could not make out why the RBI shifted so suddenly to a puzzling policy stance. And the second thing which I would like to say, so that argument, basically there are contrarian views in the market, which Dr. Subramaniam says. But the other thing which I'd like to point out is that the stance regarding the fiscal policy also, I believe that the fiscal policy stance may have been a little more flexible, because the markets were actually if you remember in FY14 when the FM had presented the first budget, the markets were abuzz with an expectations of a 4.4% deficit. Leaving aside that issue of whether a higher or lower fiscal deficit is good or bad, but I believe that the markets were convinced that we could have moved a little bit slower on the fiscal deficit target. So in my sense, Dr. Subramanian's argument is highly commended, but I only wish that could have come a little earlier.
Oh, right. I mean, I so agree with you, Soumya Kanti Ghosh. You know, I sympathize with Dr. Subramanian's point of view that there is a lot of analysts expect a rate cut, and when the rate cut didn't come, there was not enough criticism of the monetary policy. I agree, you say that it was a little puzzling, but it was not very, you know, severe criticism that the Reserve Bank faced. But, you know, Abik, don't you think that to some extent, at least, Dr. Subramanian, as Soumya says, could have made this comment earlier? He could have spearheaded the opposition and therefore have some critics at least congregating around him, and there could have been a healthy debate. Maybe he also should have spoken earlier, you think?
No, I think it's also a question of political economy and issues of coordination between, you know, the Finance Ministry and the RBI, who says what, when. But I think Subramanian has been consistently opposed to this. I think that this is a broader movement between, you know, discretion and rules.
Okay.
And I think you know, Dr. Subramanian has been on the side of discretion and, you know, discretionary fiscal policy, the discretion to let you know, policy be a little looser than what a rule would determine for a very long time. And I think he's also been articulate on the monetary policy.
Yes, several of his papers also have that point of view. But actually, he's pointing out to something else. The thrust of the paper is not really that the monetary policy and the fiscal policy is too loose. That is certainly by implication. But his bigger problem, and now Dr. Sen is also with us, Dr. Sen, his bigger problem is, as we discussed earlier today, that there is not enough opposition to policy itself, that analysts, and he holds all of us, including the media in that, are not criticizing because they fear they will lose access to RBI or to government, and hence there is too much of conformism and rationalizing of the official position. Would you agree that people don't have the spine to attack policymakers?
You know, Lata, for analysts in the private sector, I think, or for parts of the media, if they do have the feeling that any criticism will lead to lack of access, that is a very, very sad commentary. And that is something that should be attacked in itself, rather than go at it obliquely. But this whole fear of access, I think, is something fairly recent. My problem with Arvind's position on that is the assumption that all of us disagree with the RBI call. I'm not sure that's true.
Okay.
I have a feeling that a lot of people recognize the uncertainties that the economy is going through and are perfectly happy with RBI taking a cautious stand. So just because we happen to agree with RBI does not necessarily make us less critical. But the other point that you made, I think, is very valid. If there is an implicit threat that the RBI is holding out now, that's something that one should make a much larger issue of. But as I said, the very people who are being affected by it are the ones who are least able to take it up.
Okay.
So it's for people like me or who do not have any vested interest in keeping our channels open with the RBI, who can be more critical.
Okay. But you would say that there are enough people like you in the policy firmament or even outside the policy firmament, isn't it? People who can and have been taking positions against fiscal policy or monetary policy when warranted?
I think there has been. But, you know, this is where I think one really needs to get some sort of heart-to-heart information from the commercial community who are hurt by threats of access blockage.
Okay, yes, sir. I would vouch that several bankers or even financial institution officials may be a little afraid to speak in public against a policy, even if they felt so for fear of retribution in some form. Media also would be guilty in some pockets of being able to speak up just in case we lose access. But your point is taken that to a large extent a lot of people have gone along with what the RBI has been doing, because we have historically suffered from high double-digit inflation not too far back. I mean, as recently as in 2010, 11 and 12, and therefore it's legitimate that a lot of people agree with the Reserve Bank. But I think Dr. Subramanian's criticism still stands that just before the policy, at least 95% of people polled said that they expect a cut, but when the cut didn't come, and in fact you got a change in stance, there was not enough acerbic criticism of the Reserve Bank. Last word, sir, Dr. Sen.
Well, you know, on that, Lata, again, I think we need to be very clear. There is, I think, a big difference between what we expect and what we think is right.
Okay.
Yeah? Now, by and large, the way the discourse is played out is in terms of what we expect the RBI to do.
Okay. All right.
Which is not the same thing.
Yeah.